I grew up within a small, kind of tightly knit fundamentalist Christian community. Was really kind of brainwashed into believing everything that they believed and going along with all of it. Unless somebody invites Jesus into their heart, they're going to burn in hell forever. And eventually I left that behind and lost my faith. Anyone who doesn't support, transing children, for instance, is on the wrong side of history. They're definitely a bigot. They're a transphobe. They're, awful. Of course, we shouldn't believe in this stuff, that we should cut off genitals and mutilate children and do all these horrible things. Like, obviously, that should not be the case. Yeah, it's difficult when you reject a faith that everyone around you holds, just as I think transitioners do sometimes. They lose their sense of just how to navigate reality. We have a belief and body modification. It's especially difficult.
It's also very easy to tell yourself, because you've made permanent decisions and you're happy, that you have 0% regrets.
I don't think people should be getting these surgeries, just in general. That's my position.
All right, Travis Brown and Dog, welcome to my podcast. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having us. This is Nora. She is very needy.
She a Chihuahua?
Yeah, she's a Chihuahua Terrier mix, and I don't know. She just needs a lot of attention right now, I guess.
Oh,
Brought her all
I'm
the
sure
way.
my guests will be very distracted in a good way. So, Travis, you are working on a gender podcast, which you've started releasing the first episode, and tell me a bit about it.
Yes, it's a documentary actually called Uncomfortable Truths, the Reality of Gender Identity Ideology. And started working on it back in, 2022, I think, or 2023, early 2023. So it's been a little over 2 years.
Okay.
And it's been quite a ride.
Yeah, so I'll make sure to link the first episode in the description, and let's play a little teaser of it now.
And this idea that we have to teach that there's no such thing as a boy or a girl is so disruptive. So I participate a lot in the school system, and I go there and I want to see what's going on. And I make sure that he's not learning about this non-binary. At 10, there's 10-year-olds claiming they're non-binary. It's confusing, and it's a lie. It's an actual lie. We're teaching lies.
It's not kind to tell children lies, because to the teenage girl, no, actually, you're not going to grow up and become an adult man. That is impossible. All of your dealings with the world will be with that conflict between your actual sex and the sex you're presenting to the world, no matter how well you pass.
So if somebody has a severe feeling of dissociation from their sex, in principle, one would imagine that you'd be able to see that in a detailed enough brain scan if we understood brains enough. But that doesn't mean that that person has a brain of the opposite sex. We are able to look at brain scans and tell with an awful lot more than random chance whether they're male or female brains. I think it's like 90-something% accuracy. But with faces, we're close to 100% accuracy. And with genitals, we're basically at 100% accuracy. So why would we look at brain scans? I mean, if somebody's a man, they're a man. If their brain is a bit unusual for a man, okay, it's an unusual brain for a man. Like, it just doesn't mean that they have the opposite sex brain. This is just a bizarre concept.
Travis, I don't want to assume, your pronouns here or anything, but I'm guessing you may be a cis, white, straight man, or at least we're ticking some of those boxes. So why you? Why did you want to talk about this?
Yeah, well, I think anyone can comment on anything they want. One shouldn't care too much about one's identity in terms of what they comment on. I think identity politics is, in general, quite harmful and ridiculous. But why me? I mean, it's pretty much because I grew up within a small, kind of tightly knit fundamentalist Christian community, and was really kind of brainwashed into believing everything that they believed and going along with all of it. And eventually I left that behind and lost my faith. And then I was just really, so that affected my psychology, just how these intense beliefs can shape our view of reality and really cause people to do things that they would otherwise not do, or cause them to think in ways or act in ways that would be considered immoral if they were being objective about it. And then I I lived in Seattle and Portland, two very woke places, and saw a lot of the same kinds of in-group, out-group thinking, black and white thinking. Anyone is a Republican is a neo-Nazi, or anyone who voted for Trump the first time around is a fascist. And I just was struck by how ridiculous this was, and even though I'm not really a Trump supporter or a Republican, but and then you just really see that with the trans topic in particular, that anyone who doesn't support transing children, for instance, is on the wrong side of history. Maybe they're not going to hell, but they're definitely a bigot. They're a transphobe. They're awful. So that kind of dichotomous in-group, out-group thinking is really fascinating to me. And again, the same thing is operative here. If you don't believe these things, you're considered a horrible person. But if you think about it for just a few seconds, like, of course we shouldn't believe in this stuff, that we should, cut off genitals and, mutilate children and do all these horrible things. Like, obviously that should not be the case. But people are led into believing that this is they're on the right side of history when they support this. So.
Yeah, it's interesting how your past experience made you realize, and I think I have come across other people too who, have had past sort of cultish experiences, and then they're able to sort of see it for what it is. I think, once you go through something like that, then I don't know if you've seen much from Megan Phelps Roper, who did, the witch trials of J.K. Rowling. She was part of the Westboro Baptist Church, and she has a great TED Talk talking about how the kind of pros and cons of this, right? Because you, first of all, you're able to look at things more critically. I think if you've been through that kind of experience and you sort of come to terms with the cult aspect of it, you can go one or two ways, right? So you might just find another cult, but you may also become sort of so critical in your thinking that you're constantly questioning everything to be true, and getting a bit paranoid then on, what if I'm falling down another rabbit hole? I mean, do you relate to that at all in terms of where your mindset is now and being able to analyze things?
I mean, yeah, it certainly has made me more skeptical of belief systems and ideological capture. And I actually had some very similar experiences to Megan Phelps Roper. I think I first heard her on Sam Harris a long time ago. And even though my experience wasn't quite as intense as hers, there were a lot of parallels, and there were actually some identical things in terms of her parents quoting certain scriptures to her whenever she disagreed with them, and my parents quoted the exact same scripture to me. So it was just fascinating to listen to her story. But yeah, no, I don't know. I don't know. Maybe there are some downsides of having left the faith and being skeptical, but I don't know. I don't think there's anything wrong with being critically minded and skeptical. I mean, I suppose it can lead to a kind of nihilism, which I don't think is healthy. But as long as you don't go there to the nihilistic worldview or perspective, then I think it's only a good thing.
Yeah. I find with myself that you can only really devote your attention to one topic so much, right? And if you're trying to become an expert in something, then inevitably you're going to have to kind of take your opinions about something else from some sort of expert or authoritarian figure, right? But then you kind of wonder, what if I'm doing the same thing? I mean, for me, the whole kind of climate change thing, for example, like lots of people are describing that as a type of neo-religion, the net zero stuff. And I totally understand their arguments, but then at the same time, I've just not, dug into it at all enough to understand what are the valid arguments against climate change. Like, would you kind of see any of that world as a sort of neo-religious movement?
Yeah, I've certainly heard that argument. I think, Douglas Murray has talked a little bit about that, and Michael Schellenberger in particular with his book, Apocalypse Never, which is a fantastic book. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. And, people like Bjorn Lomborg and other people, they believe in the fact that the climate is changing and it is warming up, but they lay out that it's not a doomsday, right? And so there's no reason for people to, I'm sure you probably know of in the UK, I think they wear masks, and what are they called? I'm blanking on the name of that group that is basically a doomsday cult.
Extinction Rebellion or Just
exactly.
Stop Oil, one of those.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Extinction Rebellion is what I was thinking of. But yeah, so you definitely see religious elements in a certain contingent of that crowd. And again, like it's just because you may be critical of that or may not believe in every aspect of this doesn't mean that you don't acknowledge certain basic facts, like the planet is getting warmer. There are certain environmental problems. There are certain things that we should probably do and change, etc. So you don't have to like that's where I get annoyed with a lot of these conversations is that people just go all in one particular direction and then stop thinking critically anymore when they sort of find the group that most aligns with them. And the same thing, frankly, happens with the
Mm.
gender stuff to some degree too. So I think it's just kind of unfortunate.
Yeah. 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 So with your experience then, I'd be curious to know, what were some of the more radical things you used to believe, and then what was it that got you thinking and got you opening up your mind to sort of come out of that?
I mean, there's certainly a political bent to it because, as I was telling a friend the other day, a lot of the people I grew up with did want, I think, even though they might not have phrased it this way, a kind of soft theocracy. And they wanted, the Bible to be the moral standard. And so it does become political because the people I grew up with really wanted this to be in politics. There were not so much pluralists where they were like, oh, well, you can believe what you believe, and we'll believe this. I think maybe some of the people like my parents have adopted that approach more now, but so it inevitably becomes political, just like Islam with anyone who's an Islamist or a fundamentalist when it comes to being a Muslim. But no, I mean, if you think about it, unless you hold these beliefs, it's a pretty radical belief to think that unless somebody invites Jesus into their heart, they're going to burn in hell forever. I mean, that's a pretty radical belief, in my opinion. Like, you're one, it posits
Yeah.
that a soul exists and will continue beyond death for eternity, and two, it's stating that you deserve eternal punishment, eternal damnation, eternal suffering for just not holding a particular belief, which in retrospect is just it's totally insane. I mean, it's absolutely crazy.
Mm.
So and I used to think that way, and I also used to think, and this is one of the problems with the people that I grew up with and with the religion and the way it was practiced, is I was thinking, well, if this is true, we should be spending every waking moment telling everyone. We should all be evangelical missionaries, trying to convince everyone that they shouldn't go to hell. I mean, if it's real, then why are we wasting our time, right? Like, we have 80 years on the planet and then infinity, infinite amount of time afterwards. Well, clearly that's more important, right? But people just didn't take it seriously, you know.
Mm. So what was it then that started you thinking, and why was it you that started questioning it?
Interestingly enough, I think it was my own innate moral sensibility. There were just issues that I had in that I discovered in reading the Bible and studying, in particular, the Old Testament. But then eventually, I had a lot of problems with the New Testament as well. But you just look at it and you realize that God did condone through His prophets and through certain groups of people genocide and rape and things like that. So if you have a sense of morality, you're just going to start to wonder, like, well, who is this supposedly loving God, and should we be holding this God up on a pedestal and worshiping this? So it was really, it had nothing to do with whether or not I doubted the existence of God. It wasn't that. It was really just, this is disturbing to me, and I don't think I can follow this anymore. And then eventually I
Mm.
became relieved that there's no evidence for any of it, and there's no empirical tests for any of it, and there's nothing to worry about. I don't need to worry about hell or any of these other things. But it was really just a slow. It really was me turning my back on the faith because it just seemed too immoral for me.
Yeah. Helen Joyce describes detransitioners as a type of apostate of
Yeah.
the, religion of gender identity ideology. What are your thoughts on that? And what was apostasy like for you in terms of that psychological experience?
Yeah, we'll start with the second question first. Yeah, it's difficult when you reject a faith that everyone around you holds, that brings communities together and gives you social cohesion. And it's just challenging. Some people were harsher than others. But even just at an interpersonal level, you lose your sense of just as I think transitioners do sometimes, they lose their sense of just how to navigate reality at all, because your identity, who you thought you were, is just totally gone. And in the case of religion, then also your sense of what is right and wrong and what you should do with your life, your purpose. So I do think there's some overlap. And I think that, detransitioners, they believe that they're trans or non-binary or whatever, and they latch onto this, and it really is a kind of transcendent identity. And then when they start to realize that, oh, actually, this is not solving my distress, this is not solving my psychological issues, or sometimes it's physical issues, then then they end up regretting it, and then they end up being very lost. And it's it's sad and it's difficult. And then you also have the same kind of community rejection of these people, because people will say, well, they were never truly trans, or whatever, the common things that people say to reject the detransitioners, to oust them from the space. There are parallels for sure.
Mm. Yeah, the more I think about that, the more I wonder, to be a detransitioner is to be quite courageous, because like you said, a lot of detransitioners have rejected their family. They're embarrassed, they're ashamed. They have to then grapple with losing their new community. And, I wonder, even though we're seeing the rate of detransition soar, and I think it will continue to, but I wonder how many people out there kind of are still going on with trans and even their hormones or whatever, but actually possibly are really questioning it, but not really allowing themselves to take that leap because of the security they have.
Yeah, security. And also it's really uncomfortable to reject. I mean, I don't know what that's like, because often there are physical, modifications to the body. Their voices deepen if they're women and taking testosterone, or vice versa for men. So there's a whole another layer of, I mean, with a belief, when it's just a belief, I mean, that's already difficult enough because you built your identity around the belief. But when you have a belief and body modification, then it's especially difficult. So they must be courageous to choose to reject that identity and just continue to identify as the sex that they're born as. But yeah, so I assume that there must be a number of people who, as you say, aren't really sure that this is the right path for them, but they don't know what to do. I mean, they would lose a community. They can't change their bodies often, or if they do, it won't be the same. So yeah, I can imagine a lot of people being kind of stuck in that place for sure.
Yeah. I find with kind of understanding, that these ideas are like a religion, and sort of coming from a position of, oh, well, we just want to be kind, and this is kind of the new gay rights movement, and we need to be accepting XYZ, to then, the polar opposite of the kind of, the turfism world, where it's just very hard line on every single issue. Now, some claims some people make is that there is no moderate position, and eventually you do arrive at the other side of the completely sex realist, never using a preferred pronoun, kind of not really feeling like you need to give compassion to this in a lot of cases, that it actually encourages it. Even that trans influencers like Blair White, Buck Angel, who kind of disagree with maybe like 90% of the trans activist ideas. Even those people are extremely harmful and dangerous. So I'm kind of wondering, because you said it's been a couple of years, and I've been talking about this since 2023, and I have become more hardline since I've started. I still have some moderate tendencies in some ways. But I've definitely kind of moved a little bit away from where I started. So I'm kind of wondering, from when you already realize a lot of this stuff doesn't make sense and that it's wrong, and especially with kids and everything like that, up till now, is there anything then that you've further changed your mind on?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, to address the earlier point, I think you can take a hard line on specific subjects and specific instances of the ideology and still be compassionate towards people who need compassion. Some people really are just kind of lost in this. And, personally, I think Stella O'Malley does a good job at this, and others. And you can hold, a relatively hardline position and be clear about what you think and why, while also not caring about certain things, right? Like I don't care that much about wrong sexed pronouns in certain circumstances because I don't think I'm harming children, as I've been told. But yeah, so Buck is in the film. Buck is a personal friend of mine. I don't agree with Buck on a few things, and that's fine. But I guess that's where I get frustrated is Buck is a very genuine person, and even in a podcast that I did with Buck a few weeks ago to promote my series, Buck even admitted that because my position is, after doing all these interviews, in one way I've changed my mind to answer your question, is that I don't think people should be getting these surgeries, just in general. That's my position. I don't think that people should be taking these drugs and doing these things. However, I have a deeper philosophical and moral position, which is that I'm very anti-authoritarian, and I don't want people to be told what they can and can't do in the privacy of their own lives, as long as they're not negatively affecting other people. And so so people act as if or people like me, are uninformed or just not really sure of their position, or they're not parents, so they just don't take this position that we all should take, and you need to take the righteous path. And I mean, that's really just bullshit. I mean, there are just other reasons why I hold the positions that I do. And it's primarily because I'm more of a libertarian when it comes to, bodily autonomy. So it's sort of similar to, like, I don't think people should use the N-word, for instance, but should we make this illegal? Like, should we make it hate speech? Should we say that it's illegal to do this? No, we've just shamed people for doing that, and they just don't do it anymore. And in my view, that's sort of the tax to take. I don't know that we should shame people, but we can certainly inform people and offer better alternatives. And so that's my position. I think, as far as I know, that people could relieve their distress without these body modifications. And even to come back to my conversation with Buck said, maybe there was another pathway for me, but this has worked for me. So if Buck can even admit that, like, oh, maybe there was some other solution, then I don't really see why people get so upset with Buck. I mean, there are many reasons why people do, but I think that's a perfectly healthy approach to take.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. I have a lot to say about that, but that's kind of my general position.
Yeah, I reckon we're quite aligned on this, to be honest. I kind of sit in the same place as you. It's interesting you say that about Buck, because I'm friends with Buck too, and Buck was on my podcast last year, and I posed that question to Buck. I said, in an alternate reality, could this have gone another way if you were offered something different? And at the time, Buck found it an interesting question, and I'm not going to be able to quote Buck directly on what was said, but the argument was sort of, well, Buck lived for 30 years, as a quote unquote woman, and felt like Buck had exhausted every other option. So I find that very interesting to hear, because maybe those kind of probing things have got Buck thinking, I don't know. Or because even if you're sort of as realistic as Buck, I think it's also very easy to tell yourself, because you've made permanent decisions and you're happy, then that you have 0% regrets, or
Sure.
that things couldn't have been another way. It's a more comfortable place to sit in your mind. So, and I feel the same way about other trans creators like Blair White and stuff. I mean, Blair transitioned when she was like 20 or something, and had like horrendous childhood abuse, homosexuality, a lot of homophobia. So, she's someone, for example, I really think it could have gone another way, but then, you've been living an alter ego for years, and then you also have, in her case, a whole career built off it. So and a boyfriend who thinks he's straight. So it's, there's a lot then, I think, that's, motivating them maybe not to question those things, even though I think the medical side of it, if you can get off those hormones and stuff, it's obviously ultimately going to be better for your body, right? And so I'm assuming that you don't think that there's a kind of true trans side of the spectrum, and that some people, genuinely, I think the argument is, I genuinely have gender dysphoria and I genuinely needed this treatment. That's kind of the line I hear.
Right, right. I mean, some people maybe do genuinely have gender dysphoria, or you could call it distress about their sex body, however you want to phrase it. I mean, people get very nitpicky. I don't think that matters. I think what matters is what is the solution to it, right? And again, as I've spoken to many psychiatrists and psychotherapists and doctors, it seems to me that there are other pathways other than the medical route. And, I could change my mind, maybe, eventually we could discover that maybe some people need these things. But from the research that I've done, and I've talked to people all over the world and filmed, all these conferences and read both sides of the argument, it just seems to me that there's basically no evidence, no good evidence to support the need for these kinds of medical interventions, and a lot of evidence just to support that. No, I mean, if you leave most kids alone, they grow out of it. And then if you help those people or kids who haven't grown out of it, maybe it's a combination of things. It can be trauma, it can be all the things that we know, autism, etc. So yeah, I don't think trans makes sense as a category of person. It's not like a new category of person just because somebody suffers from gender distress. But I don't extirpate the word trans from my vocabulary entirely, because it just kind of makes sense to use when you're talking about certain things, or you can say trans identifying or whatever. But no, I don't think that there's a condition that necessitates those interventions.
What would you say then, hypothetically, if someone was struggling with this kind of cluster of symptoms about their sex, which you may call gender dysphoria, and they are given an alternative path and they try that for a decade and they still desperately want to modify their body to live as the other sex? I mean, I'm in two minds sometimes, because I think the simplest way I put it is, when people make body modification decisions, there's always going to be some people that are happy with it and some people who are not. For any medical treatment that's created, even if it's a shitty medical treatment that doesn't get, approved, there's going to be like 10% of people who actually say, oh, I'm cured or whatever, I feel better. So I kind of see it a little bit like that. And I suppose that the libertarian approach, I kind of partially agree with, but I find it really difficult to reconcile because, number one, if there is no medical basis that this benefits people on average, or with a good success rate enough to warrant insurance and doctors having to do this, then it should not be done in a medical setting because it's not a medical treatment. But if you move it to being purely cosmetic, then you potentially have no gatekeeping, and it's difficult to argue that someone gets therapy when then they're trying to get a cosmetic procedure. So I find the solution to be very imperfect, because I think it would make far more sense as a cosmetic thing, but then you're being prescribed medication which needs to be done by an endocrinologist. Like it's very complicated. But I do feel like in the future a lot of doctors won't want to do this anymore because of how much backlash and lawsuits they're going to face.
Yeah, no, it is complex. I mean, maybe there's some kind of happy medium between. I feel like cosmetic doesn't quite, I've used that word too, but it doesn't quite capture what it is, because it's so drastic and there's an ideology behind it. And even if someone's not influenced by the ideology, it is still essentially a medical intervention. I mean, you're removing body parts, or you're taking drugs, as you say, that need prescriptions. So, maybe there's some way to change the laws and how this is administered. But I don't know the solution. I mean, I guess, to answer the question, that is something that people used to do a little bit more. They would wait like a year or two and undergo psychological evaluations and not get any of the surgeries or anything. They would dress as the opposite sex. And then the doctors would say, okay, well, now you've done this for the 1 or 2 years. Now we'll do their operation. I think that certainly makes more sense than just pushing people through this and saying, oh, let's do it tomorrow, or next month. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe as more and more data comes out and more psychological interventions or even physical interventions, like fixing people's physical health. I interviewed one detransitioner, Camille Kiefel, who said that it was getting certain things, I forget the details because it's been a while, certain things in her body regulated in the right way that then helped her start feeling more comfortable being the sex that she is. So there's a number of things that could be done, and maybe we'll be able to be more comprehensive in the future with that, but to just offer better solutions.
What do you think about, I think obviously some people transition because of certain incentives, and I think some of those incentives are that the medical industry decide to kind of essentially give this person a promise that society will view them as the other sex. I don't think it was always that way. I think the doctors were more cautious in saying, not everyone is going to accept this and you're not going to be able to do certain things. Whereas it definitely moved towards the position of telling children you'll be identical to a female. There are kids who've been told that.
Right.
Or even adults, like they kind of go into it with this sort of unspoken promise from the world. You get to enter female spaces, sports. And I wonder if those incentives are removed. And I agree with removing all of those incentives. And, one thing I used to kind of be on the fence about was being able to change documentation, like your birth certificate and passport. And now I feel far less enthusiastic about that because there isn't really any other law in society which allows us to go back and rewrite the past. And why should this group be able to do it if another group can't? So that's something I think shouldn't be a thing. And I think a lot of these sort of true transsexuals, quote unquote, who take a more moderate position, and some of whom I really like as people and I think are really funny and have a lot of good things to say. I think that's something that will be particularly difficult for them because a lot of them see their role as, I've worked so hard to pay for all my surgeries, to get on this medication, all the psychological evaluations, to change my ID, and I've respected women. But then, even them, we're kind of saying, well, you can't have this. It's not fair. And I just wonder, with those incentives removed, are people really going to go down this route of making their lives so complicated when they can't gain access to the spaces, they can't change their ID? So I think that might be a kind of something that might dissuade people.
Yeah. I would have to ask, why someone would want to change their ID markers and markers on their ID or their birth certificate if it's not for nefarious reasons like wanting to enter into female-only spaces, etc. I mean, maybe there are some arguments for it. I don't know what they are, but I don't. It's hard to imagine really benign reasons for wanting to do that, other than people saying, "Well, this is how I feel, and therefore I want to, I want it to be acknowledged on my certificates." But that doesn't seem necessary if you just want to live this way privately. And again, that's what I would stress, is that if people want to do this in their own lives, personally, privately, and they're not trying to gain access to especially female-only spaces, or trying to really pretend to be the other sex, then yeah, why do they need those? I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, I've even seen some of those creators, one in particular, Alexis Blake. I don't know if you've heard of Alexis, but Alexis has a YouTube channel, and I've kind of liked a lot of what Alexis has to say so far. It's more moderate position with trans, but then this ruling came out from the Supreme Court, and suddenly I feel like Alexis is becoming more entrenched in the kind of trans ideology, because now sort of Alexis is, I'm trying so hard not to use pronouns here, but Because I sort of use pronouns for people I respect, and I'm kind of losing respect for him because, he started saying like some of the tropes about this Supreme Court ruling, that this actually harms women because women are going to be questioned whether if they're a butch woman, if they're a masculine woman, they're going to be interrogated. People are going to want to look at people's genitals. And even with this case recently of this, this poor woman who wants to set up a gym in London for only biological females, like Alexis, even this trans creator, like male to female, even popped off about that when, he's supposed to be taking this moderate position. And, you just take a step back from it and you think, at the end of the day, this is a man telling women that this is going to, like, telling women what does and does not harm them, which is just more of a sign that you're not a woman. You're never going to be a woman. Like, how are you to know what protections women need? And you went through all of these things, jumped over all these hurdles, got all of these invasive surgeries, and you want to be able to change your documentation. Like, I think, like, what are your thoughts on this Supreme Court ruling and all of these arguments about, oh, well, what about trans men, like, going into female spaces? What about masculine women being challenged? I mean, that's the kind of stuff that's being put forward.
Yeah, so you have to forgive me. I'm so busy with my current work in Budapest that I'm blanking on what the Supreme Court ruling is. What happened?
Yeah, so basically, we have the Equality Act 2010, which outlines various characteristics in which you're, not allowed to be unlawfully discriminated against. And, they have sexual orientation, for example, religion. One of them is sex. And we also then have the Gender Recognition Act, which allows, certain people, after going through certain things, to get a certificate to be legally the other sex and to change their birth certificate and stuff like that. But those two laws were in conflict with one another because the question was whether, when the Equality Act was written, if sex meant biological sex or legal sex. Because if it means legal sex, then technically those with the gender recognition certificate would be discriminated against if they were denied access to a female sport or a female only space. So obviously the world has kind of erupted since then, and the trans activist argument is this is going to be harmful for women because masculine women are now going to be interrogated when they go into female spaces, and they're going to be degraded for having to show their body parts. And they're also saying that trans men will be able to go in, they'll go into female spaces and then get called out. And they're saying cis men will go into female spaces pretending to be trans men. So they're sort of pushing back on this, making it sound like it's going to be harmful for women. I was just wondering, kind of, what do you think of those ideas around the spaces?
Yeah, that's challenging. I haven't thought too deeply on how to solve that problem. I'm not really sure, though I don't suspect that it would happen as often or as, I don't think it's going to be some kind of epidemic of checking people. And would they really check people's genitals? I mean, who's going to do that? I don't know. But it seems to me that the solution is pretty obvious. If you want to check someone's sex, and they cannot put some kind of false identification on, or some kind of the wrong sex on their identification, then you would just check their identification, right? I mean, it would just really be that simple, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I think, and then also just, if we're going to create these kind of mimics of the other sex in society, then there has to be provisions in society for that. Like, if we're making things this confusing, and private businesses should be encouraged to have a neutral space. Government, I think it should be policy, and if you're a country that does this to people in public institutions, you need a neutral space. And to be honest, like, a lot of these places do. So I guess my last question on this then for you would just be, you've said that you don't feel like this should really be a thing, but what would your prediction be in 10, 20 years time? Like, where are we going to be with this?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I hope most of society will have moved more, away from, and I suspect away from, believing all of these just insane tropes and, just the typical trans talking points, or the trans activist talking points. And I think that we'll get there. But as Helen Joyce and others have pointed out, you'll still be left with all of these people who have detransitioned, or people maybe stuck in transition, who, this has affected them and will for the rest of their lives. So that's tragic. And then you have, parents who basically did this to their children, and they will never probably change their mind. So even if much of society has kind of moved on and adopted a saner approach to sex-based rights and not mutilating children, you'll still have the activists out there, because some of these parents and people who have pushed this, they can't admit the truth otherwise, or at least often won't admit the truth, because then they have to look inward at what they've done to their own children. So it's going to be with us for a while. Yeah,
I've heard it said before that with cults, there's always going to be, I'm not sure if I'm getting the percentage right, but 10 to 20% of people who go to their grave sort of, believing it, even if the majority of the world moves on.
Right.
Thanks so much. I've really enjoyed our conversation. And where can people go find your documentary, and when is the next episode coming out?
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for having me. It's a great conversation. You can see the film either on X by following me at Become the Signal. It's pinned to my profile, or on YouTube, which is also Become the Signal, I believe. And I'm not entirely sure when the next episode will be done. I'm still working on trying to get some funding for that. So if anyone wants to contribute, they can go to my GiveSendGo/Uncomfortable Truths, the name of the series. So hopefully within the next 6 to 8 months, something like that. I just need to raise some money, and I want to do some nice animation and tell the stories of parents and families who've been dealing with this, and give advice to families, because I think that's really needed. So that's the goal. But thanks for having me.
Of course. Well, yeah, I'll link your socials and everything in the description. And yeah, thank you very much.
Awesome. Take care.